Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Anna Pachias. I am the Annual Fund Director for the Shenandoah National Park Trust, which is the official philanthropic partner for Shenandoah National Park. And the Trust invests in programs and initiatives that protect, enhance, and preserve the resources of Shenandoah National Park today and for generations to come. And tonight's webinar will introduce you to a 2023 project that we're funding for this fiscal year that's happening right now in Shenandoah. And we're very fortunate we have the lead biologist with us to tell us about the project. We know that humans are entering the park's natural habitats in really big numbers, growing numbers, which directly impacts Shenandoah's flora and fauna. And we are also becoming ever more aware of the alarming effects of climate change. And the park's native species face grave threats from climate change. When we hear those words, climate change, we may worry about the future, especially the future of Shenandoah, but the exciting thing that we're going to hear about tonight is there are many reasons to be hopeful, and the Brook Trout project is just one reason for hope. So we're excited that so many people are joining us to hear about it tonight. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to share some of the other programs that the Trust is funding that address climate change and that protect native species. The Trust invests in efforts to remove non-native plants and insects that crowd out native plants and degrade habitats. We also invest in land acquisition, including the most recent tract of land, which encompasses the headwaters of Naked Creek, which allows the park to expand its watershed protections. And so programs like these not only protect the watershed and native species, but they also protect the tree canopy, which directly impacts temperatures in the park and allows for cooling. So these are just a few of the many reasons to be hopeful, as you'll learn this evening. And we are now going to hear from Evan Childress. It's my great pleasure to introduce him to all of you. He is Shenandoah National Park's Supervisory Fish Biologist. Evan has a PhD in marine science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he came to Shenandoah 3 years ago after working for the Fish and Wildlife Service. Evan always knew he wanted to work in aquatic environmental conservation, and he's keen to continue studying the park's streams to get ahead of our changing climate and other threats to native aquatic species. After Evan's presentation, there will be time for Q&A, and we are monitoring the chat. So please, as questions occur to you, pop them into the chat, and my colleague Emily Digney and I will be monitoring it, and we'll make sure to get your questions to Evan after his presentation. Hi, Evan. Thank you for coming tonight to tell us about the important work that you and your team are doing in the park. So take it away.
Thanks, Anna. Thanks to the Trust for putting this on, and thanks to all of you for joining us this evening. So as Anna said, I'm going to be talking about our cold water resources in Shenandoah National Park and some of what we're learning about what's happening to the streams and some of what we're going to be trying to do in the coming years to think about the issues that we're seeing. So I hope that most of you are familiar with Shenandoah National Park. It was established as a mountain park to try to be similar to the parks that were being established out in the western United States, but close to the U.S. Capitol. And it was established mostly for the views of beautiful mountains and as an escape. But it also captured a lot of beautiful mountain streams that are home to brook trout that need cold water. So we have a lot of brook trout within the park. In the mid-Atlantic, Shenandoah National Park is one of the last remaining strongholds for the species. And just because of the geography, we have taller mountains, we have a lot of forest cover, we have nice cold water. And people like to fish for brook trout. There's a lot of cultural value in the species. President Hoover used to come and fish in the Rapidan River before the park was established here in 1935. And there's also a lot of ecological value in brook trout. They are a keystone species that act as a major influence on all of the biological community within streams and in headwater streams in particular. So our mission here at the Park Service is to conserve the, I'm going to paraphrase this, the natural resources and provide for the enjoyment of those resources for the current generation, as well as leaving them unimpaired for future generations. So that's a long time. Unimpaired for future generations is the time scale that we have to think on here. And when the park was established, you know, they drew a line on a map, and the understanding of the day was that you keep the impact of people minimal, you don't allow farming, you don't allow timber harvest, and the system sustains itself, right? That this would be robust with those simple actions. And although less simple when you have so much boundary, but at least conceptually simple. And what we've learned through, you know, the second half of the 20th century and continuing today is that there are many things that pay no attention to a park boundary. Those include invasive species and forest pests, some of which Anna was referring to in her introduction, as well as things like acid rain and climate change. So, you know, I'm going to start with climate change, but I'm also going to talk about acid deposition here tonight because it is a large part of the background of the system that we're going to be talking about. So climate change is causing temperature increases in Shenandoah National Park, around Shenandoah National Park, across most of the world, really. These particular temperatures are from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And, you know, it's a mean annual temperature, which isn't very intuitive for you and I, but it is quite obvious that here at the end of the 20th century and through 2020 that there is an uptick. So we're seeing an increase in temperatures around the park. These are data from directly in the counties right around the park. The situation for precipitation or rain or snow is less clear. So we have some expectation that winters and springs might get a little wetter. This spring certainly isn't a little bit wetter, and that summers might get a little bit drier. And overall, the expectation is that we're going to have more extremes, big storms, and more severe droughts as well. And this is a picture of Payne Run in 2021, which dried up for a couple of miles. So that whether that's going to be part of the expectation going forward is not certain, but when it is dry, it can cause severe harm to these systems, which can be as much as completely drying up in a giant river channel like this one. And it was hot today, and so I wondered whether we were breaking any records, and I looked it up, and we didn't break any records today. I don't think we were a couple of degrees from the record high for the date for April 20th. But I did notice on the National Weather Service's website that for this area, for this forecasting area, this is the warmest year to date since 1871. So that's average temperature, the highest average highs. So the maximum temperatures in a day are again, broke the record for the year to date. And also both of those have broken records so far for April. So very warm. And the warmest year so far since they started recording these things in 1871. And it also broke the record for the least amount of snowfall in that forecasting area. I think it was 0.2 inches, so not much snow. So we think about climate change sometimes as what does the future look like? This is actually what the present looks like. This is climate change. We are living in climate change right now. It's happening outside your door. It's happening in Shenandoah National Park. It's here. And so it's time to start thinking about how we react to what's already here and what we want the future to look like. So one thing about climate change, though, is it doesn't impact everywhere the same. So this is a graph, and I'm going to show you quite a few graphs this evening. I hope you like graphs. I like graphs. I'm a scientist, And I think that they can show things that I can't explain otherwise. So, this is elevation, and I should have changed these to feet. 300 is more like is like 1,000 feet, 600, 2,000, and 900 is like 3,000 feet. So you can see that at 3,000 feet, the stream temperatures are much cooler than they are down around the boundary at 1,000 feet of in the park. So elevation has a big impact on stream temperatures. So, pretty obvious, things tend to get cooler as you go up in elevation, but it makes the point that this isn't going to play out the same way everywhere across the landscape. And so we need to figure out the particular places that are most vulnerable, the particular places that are going to be really strong and that we need to make sure remain that way. So the backdrop to climate change is the historical effects of acid deposition. So acid rain, or acid, more accurately or specifically called acid deposition because it can come in multiple forms, was a major issue in the second half of the 20th century. In 1994, there were amendments to the Clean Air Act. And so this is acid deposition across the United States at that time. Red is bad, basically, lots of acid on the landscape. And then here's that same map in 2010. And lo and behold, that legislation, those amendments to the Clean Air Act in 1994 made a big difference. And we do not have the same level of acid deposition that we did back in those days. And the University of Virginia, the Shenandoah Watershed Study, has done an excellent job of documenting the effects of acid deposition on the ecosystems of Shenandoah National Park. So started by Jim Galloway and continued by Todd Scanlon and Amy Riscassi, and I think I saw Susie Mabin on the guest list this evening. All have played a major role in helping us understand what this means for our ecosystems. So one of the big things that they have learned is that geology matters a lot. So, when you go into the park and there's forest everywhere, it might seem like everything's pretty similar. But if you go in particular to the southwestern part of the park, the geology down there is quite different. And you can see it in the forests. They tend to be a little more sparse and dry and almost look a little bit stunted. And those are growing on this siliciclastic or silica geology type, which doesn't do a very good job of buffering the acid deposition. So this graph over here has the 3 different geology types, and these are average pHs for the stream water that we've collected while we are doing other things out there. And 7, if you recall, is neutral. So, that's essentially not harmful at all. And then as you get down into under 6 and particularly under 5, it starts getting very harmful to the aquatic biota. And this siliciclastic geology type has lots of pHs that are pretty low, whereas these other ones do not. And so, again, although the park is receiving not exactly the same amount of acid everywhere, a similar amount everywhere, and the effects are quite different in different places. So these places have been hit hard. What does that mean for the brook trout? And then also, what are we expecting for brook trout as we move forward into additional climate change? So first, we'll talk about some of the results that we've seen from our monitoring program. So we go out and do electrofishing, which basically uses a battery and electricity to temporarily stun the fish, and then we scoop them up in nets, and they are totally fine. They recover in a bucket, and we can count them and measure them. And we do that in these fixed reaches, fixed stream sections around the park, and that gives us a really good sense of what's happening over time. So at the same places that we go back to over and over again. So when we look at how many fish are in those places that have been hit hard by acid deposition, we see that there are fewer brook trout in general. you know, there are other things happening. There aren't always a lot of fish when the pH is higher, but you know, along this x-axis, if you go down into the low pHs, you just never get a lot of brook trout, which would be, you know, high on this y-axis. So, you know, clearly the pH is having a dampening effect on the brook trout. And I'm going to show you a little bit about what's happening in this stream. This is Meadow Run, which is, if you've ever hiked on the Rip Rap Trail, that goes through the Meadow Run watershed. And it's a little bit higher than some of these other ones, despite its in brook trout numbers, despite its low pH. And interestingly, you know, at Meadow Run, if you look at the data over the last 30 years or so, slightly less than 30 years, the brook trout numbers seem to be increasing. So, you know, it goes up and down a lot. This sort of variation year to year is a classic pattern that brook trout show. Brook trout are very sensitive to winter floods and fall droughts. The eggs spend the winter in the gravel incubating. And so if there's a big flood, it can basically wipe out the trout nests, which are called redds, and basically destroy the reproduction for that year. And so in these low years, that's probably what's happening, or something similar. And then in other years, conditions are great and they can have a boom year. So that boom bust kind of a pattern is very normal. But if you look kind of overall at the pattern, there are never very many fish back in the 90s. Whereas if you move into, you know, this last hash mark is 2020, you know, in that zone, you have quite a few fish every year. Even a low year is higher than the high years in those early days, right? So there does seem to be a trend, and the statistics do confirm that there's something real happening here. It's not just something, a deception of your eye. But actually, I'm going to talk a little bit about why that's happening. So, so although this watershed was hit really hard by acid deposition, you know, some of UVA's more recent work has shown that things are actually improving quite a bit. So, you know, although it can be hard to detect, the worst pH conditions, the worst acid conditions are not happening as much anymore. So the severity of it is decreasing, and those tend to happen during big floods. And so when it floods, the pH does not go down as far as it used to. And so although it's sort of a subtle change, that is apparently having quite a positive effect on the fish. So if you look down here, the average might be 30 fish a year, and up here it's, you know, maybe 70 fish a year. So it's come up quite a bit. But that is not the case everywhere. So in the places that we thought were going to be more robust, they were sort of our strongholds. We're seeing some concerning patterns. So this is the North Fork Thornton River, which is near Sperryville in Rappahannock County. And you can see that, you know, in the 90s and early 2000s, things went up and down, but there were always quite a few fish. And in the last 10 years, that is not the case. And in fact, in 2022, we went out and sampled this site and caught 0 brook trout for the first time ever. So what's happening here? We used our monitoring data to try to understand what the patterns were. Where were things going well? Where were things going poorly? And one of the things that is, you know, plays out in the data set as a whole, in addition to what I'm showing you here, is that the siliciclastic streams, the ones that were hit hard by acid rain, are recovering. Things are going quite well in those streams, especially in larger streams, which is very consistent with what UVA has found. The larger streams seem to be recovering faster from the acid, and then the fish are responding in those places. But in other streams, on other geology types, and especially at low elevations and in small streams, things are not going very well. So we've seen major declines in in brook trout in those places. So this is just one example of what we're learning from that. So these are, it's odd to call something in the past a prediction, but that is technically what it is, because this is a hypothetical stream based on the data that we have collected, the real data, at 1,000, 2,000, or 3,000 feet. And, it's a small stream. So in small streams at low elevations, we're seeing the brook trout are tanking, basically. They're going very close to zero, and several of them we have lost brook trout. And then at the middle elevations, things are going a little bit better, but they are declining, definitely. And then at high elevations, everything seems to be okay. The populations are stable, and the numbers are actually higher, right? They're able to support more fish despite having the same amount of stream up there. So so this is one of the patterns that came out of the data. And if you recall the pattern between stream temperature and elevation, it really mirrors this pattern where the low elevations are hot and the high elevations are cool. And we have a lot of work to do to really understand why this is happening. There are several competing hypotheses, and one of them certainly is that stream temperatures are getting into the stressful zone for brook trout. And there are others that involve changes in precipitation and how that moves soil and sediment around, which can also be a problem for trout. And there are others that I'm not going to go through all of them today, but this pattern with elevation is suggestive that it could be related to climate change. And so that's one of the hypotheses that we're pursuing most aggressively. That's sort of the next step in this research. So, overall, what we've seen recently in brook trout is that there are some positives. We're seeing this recovery in places that were impacted by acid rain, acid deposition, and that is a really encouraging sign. And then in other places, especially these low elevation small streams, there's some pretty concerning patterns happening, and we need to figure out why that's happening and see what we can do about it. So like I said, that relationship with elevation is reminiscent of this relationship with stream temperature. That doesn't mean that this is the cause necessarily, but it is suggestive, and is something that we're going to be pursuing. So another thing that affects stream temperatures, and I am going to focus more on temperatures here because we know that they're going to continue to increase. So, many of them are within the tolerance of brook trout currently, but as we go forward, we want to also understand what to expect. So this is a graph that shows the effect of springs or groundwater. So groundwater, if you've been into a cave, it's, the temperature is very stable, right? It's cool and well, it's cool in the summer and warm in the winter. It's around 52 degrees, that annual mean temperature that I showed you earlier that was changing with climate change. That's essentially what temperature a cave is all year round. And the same is true of groundwater. So water that's just flowing under the ground in the soil tends to be that same temperature. And so when that enters a stream, it keeps the stream stable in its temperature. So these two lines are two different streams. This red one is the North Fork Thornton River, which I just showed you the fish from. And then, the y-axis is temperature. Choose your Fahrenheit or Celsius. And this is just one day. So, midnight, it starts here. And then, while it's dark and getting colder, the stream gets colder. And then the sun rises and it gets warmer and warmer and warmer. And then the sun sets or goes behind the mountain, which is pretty early in this watershed. And then it starts cooling off again, right? But you look at this other one and it's really not moving that much. And this is sort of a classic signal of spring-fed stream, so this is groundwater that's moderating the water temperature in this stream. So in spite of experiencing essentially the same air temperatures, these two sites are at the same elevation, and they shouldn't really be any different in air temperature. This one hardly moves across the course of the day, and whereas the North Fork Thornton goes up and down. So now I'm going to show you kind of the whole season and what that looks like. So this is we just happen to have some data from 2010. We now have put out temperature loggers again across a large number of sites within the park, but we haven't gotten data from those yet. But this little up and down that you see across the season, that's every day it goes up, every day it goes down. But how much it goes up and how much it goes down is very different between the two streams. So you can see that the North Fork Thornton really responds to a hot spell, and brook trout tend to get stressed, in the 21.5 zone of Celsius, 71-ish, and it gets well above that in the North Fork Thornton, and it doesn't stay up there for very long, right? It comes down at night, but it does take these excursions into a very stressful zone. Whereas even though the average temperature isn't all that different at this other stream overall run, the conditions stay quite suitable throughout the entire season. So the amount of groundwater that's coming into a stream makes a big difference for the temperature of that stream and how the fish experience the weather and will experience climate change. Because as the climate warms, this overall run is going to be much more resistant to change. It's going to be able to maintain relatively cool temperatures despite having warm air temperatures. Over a long term, it will continue to rise some, especially because our groundwater at the park is relatively shallow. And so it does respond to air temperatures. It's just kind of slow. And so there is still concern, but the more groundwater you have in a stream, the more stable and the more resilient it's going to be. And so the U.S. Geological Survey has been doing some research on this topic and trying to figure out how springs are distributed throughout the park and what that means for stream temperatures. And interestingly, they are kind of distributed. It's not completely random, but it's not as structured as you might think. So, we don't have spring-fed rivers and, surface flow rivers that are not spring-fed. We have spring-fed areas within rivers, and then other areas that are very sensitive to the air temperature, and then another spring-fed area. And so it's really a mosaic, and it's going to be fairly complicated to try to figure out exactly what those strongholds might be, because it's not distributed in a way that is very consistent, where you have, this is a really cold stream everywhere, which would make things easier in some ways, but it also means that there are springs distributed across the landscape in ways that might protect brook trout, even within an otherwise challenging stream. So we have some information gaps that we're hoping to plug with a study, partly with a study that I'm going to talk about in a minute. And then, yeah, so I guess I'm just going to go through these information gaps. So the first is, what is causing the brook trout decline? So, I waved my hands a little bit and suggested that it could be climate change. And we're going to look into specifically whether there is evidence of that, or whether the evidence points in some other direction. And we have funding to do that in a collaboration with the U.S. Geological Survey. And then we have a couple other questions, given these concerning patterns that we've seen in some of our low elevation streams, have brook trout been disappearing from some of those places? And then, the third and most positive question that we have is there unoccupied suitable habitat where brook trout could be introduced or reintroduced in some cases, for example, above waterfalls. So, brook trout can't swim over waterfalls, but in some cases there is lots of stream up above a waterfall at high elevations with good flow. that might be suitable for refuge for brook trout going forward. And so we need to improve our understanding of where those places might be so that we can consider whether introductions in those kinds of places would be a benefit to the overall system and help us to conserve brook trout. And to that end, we applied for some funding, and the Shenandoah National Park Trust was, we think, made a great decision in funding an eDNA survey. So this is environmental DNA, which is essentially little bits of DNA that are floating around in the stream. So as fish are swimming around, the little bits of their skin or scales or slime or excretions contain DNA. And so if you scoop that up in a bottle of water, and you can filter it and then essentially use PCR, just like a COVID test, to amplify that signal, and it tells you whether there are brook trout in there. And in some cases, it may actually tell us, at least in a relative sense, how many brook trout are likely to be there. So these are all the sites that we're planning to hit. So, you know, I talked a lot about our monitoring data, and those data are great for telling us what's been happening over time, because we go back and we revisit the same places. But it also means that we're not getting samples from everywhere. And so the point of this survey is to really get a comprehensive look at the park. Like, what is the state of the park right now? Have we lost brook trout? Where are the places that are doing better than we expected? Maybe because there is more spring-fed influence in some of those little low elevation streams. And yeah, so the goals of the project are to assess that brook trout presence, absence across the entire park in every watershed, and then look specifically at these waterfalls and say, okay, is there suitable habitat that could serve as a refuge but doesn't currently support brook trout because they just can't get there? So those are the goals, and we're doing this in collaboration with largely with Trout Unlimited chapters. So we're organizing volunteers actually to go out on June 10th to collect water samples that we'll filter, and we'll analyze for the brook trout DNA, and we'll figure out how the brook trout are distributed and where our opportunities might be to restore brook trout, and for places that, you know, in the places that might be doing better than expected, to make sure that there aren't other stressors that are going to impact them. Let's see. So a question that I often get is, what can I do? And I have a few things that you can do. The scale of these things varies quite a bit. So you don't have to do them all, but I do encourage you to try to do them all. The first one is stopping climate change, and I am serious about this. You know, it's obviously a big deal to stop climate change. But you know, whatever that means to you, in whatever way that you can advocate for stopping climate change, that ultimately is going to be a major stressor, not just on the brook trout here in the park, which are likely to suffer greatly from climate change, but for the system as a whole. You know, there are a lot of things that react to temperature in ways that we don't fully understand yet, and in some in ways that we know are going to be destructive. And then the other two are much more practical, but are also more like treating the symptoms than treating the underlying disease. So, you know, those of you who fish, you know, a good rule of thumb is not to fish when the stream temperatures are above 70 degrees. Those temperatures are stressful for fish, and so giving the fish a little space and not stressing them out during that condition is helpful. And then also, just don't move rocks in the stream. A lot of people move rocks around in the stream to build up a little dam, have a little swimming hole, and doing that does two things. It disturbs trout food, you know, the little macroinvertebrates, the insects that live under rocks, mayflies, stoneflies, caddisflies, that kind of thing, are disturbed, and so they float downstream when you do that kind of thing. And then it also creates barriers. It makes places where the fish can't move through the stream to seek refuge in a different part of the stream when conditions get stressful. And so, at the park, we are committed to doing what we can, and we recognize that there are challenging trends happening on the landscape, but there are also bright spots, right? We're seeing recovery from acid deposition, and even in some of these places where we're seeing declines, there may be opportunities for positive change, and especially when we're able to identify places that are robust and should sort of form the core of our portfolio going forward. We can take that information and we can protect the trees along those streams, and we can make sure that sedimentation from trails and roads doesn't cause impacts from those other stressors. So we can pay special attention to these places once we identify them to make sure that we are maintaining a healthy brook trout resource within the park. And that's all I have. So thank you so much for joining us tonight, and thanks for listening. And I'd be happy to answer questions if folks have them.
We've got them, Evan. Thank you so much for that. That was so interesting. Got lots of good feedback in the chat. And I'm just going to start firing questions at you. Sound good?
Sounds good.
One of our guests was interested in fishing, and I think you answered this question by saying, don't fish when the temperatures are above 70 degrees, but he just wanted to know what effects fishing have. And besides the not fishing at the 70-degree mark, what else can you say about fishermen and fisherwomen?
Yep. So there actually isn't great information on brook trout specifically for this, but there are a lot of studies on catch and release fishing, and in most cases, survival is okay, but it often will reduce the growth of fish, and that's especially true when there are stressful conditions for some other reason. So I'm kind of extrapolating from those studies on different species, but it's likely to have similar effects. So when it's hot, it's likely to stress out the brook trout, and it may not kill them, but it's likely to, cause them to not be able to put on as much weight, not have as many eggs that next year, and just kind of dampen their viability a little bit.
Gotcha. That's sobering, and thank you for those details. Michael wants to know, are there some strains of brook trout within the park believed to be more temperature tolerant and or more resilient to flow regime changes?
We don't really know. So we're lucky in the park to have relatively intact genetics, meaning that the history of stocking, which there was quite a bit of stocking in the park in the early days, did not kind of wash out the native genetics, and we have largely intact fish. And there is actually one strain in the Rapidan drainage and around it that is unique to the park. It's not found in other places, and it's genetically distinct. Whether those are more tolerant of different conditions, we don't know. That's just kind of getting off the ground in the research to try to understand which genes are responsible for temperature tolerance, and whether we can identify individuals or strains or locations that have populations that might be more resilient because of those genes, but we just don't know that yet.
A couple more fishing related questions. Is the park thinking of closing some streams from fishing? And 2, are brown trout affecting the populations of the native brook trout?
So we don't have a plan to close fishing at this point. I think it is something that we'll be talking about over the next couple of years. And so if you do have thoughts about it, we are interested in how people feel about changes to fishing regulations.
Great. Thank you, Evan.
And then brown trout are present in a couple of park streams. We're lucky not to have a broad distribution within the park. And we do have efforts to remove those. And so we do maintain healthy populations of brook trout in those locations, despite having brown trout too. So I think that our removal efforts kind of keep it at bay. But in many places, there is evidence of brown trout having negative influence on brook trout populations.
Wow, I would never have thought to ask that. That was a great question. Thank you. Alan wants to thank you for mentioning sedimentation from hiking trails. He has observed this. What measures are being taken to mediate this? And this might be out of your purview, Evan. So, we're happy to relay to Alan who he can talk to about that. But if you could address that, please take a crack at it.
No, we do. We do understand the potential for sedimentation, and maintaining trails to reduce erosion is good for lots of reasons. It means that you have to maintain the trail less. It doesn't wash away. It doesn't get muddy. It doesn't get dangerous. And so, our goal, we have standards for trail maintenance, and it's hard to keep up with 500 miles of trails.
Yes.
And so, we do our best, and we do have the standards, and recognizing the places that are most vulnerable is one of the things that's really important here. So that's part of what I'm trying to do, is to identify these places that are just critically important, and so we can focus there and say these trails better be good because these streams are going to be good for other reasons.
Right. And I do want to say that the trust does help the park with trail maintenance. It's something that we invest in. 2 more questions coming in fast. Other than brown trout, which invasives are problematic? And what do you know about food changes in the food availability for brook trout?
So what was the first? Oh, invasives. So we don't have many aquatic invasive species. I would say that the biggest deal for trout is actually the forest pest. So emerald ash borer, hemlock woolly adelgid affect the riparian forest. So the trees that live along the stream provide shade and keep the water cool. And hemlocks especially. If you've ever been in a hemlock grove, it's dark, it's cool. It really changes the system. And so the loss of those has been a really big deal. And we've had one of those every 5 to 10 years for
Could
decades.
I pop in for a minute about the HWA
and the trust also does a great job of supporting work to treat those hemlocks and
Yes.
and ashes to knock those back. So we have thousands of hemlocks still in the park thanks to the trust support of that program. And
before you do the other question, one of our audience members actually wants to know if you've graphed the effects of thinning hemlock from the hemlock woolly adelgid damage. Since we know that affects the tree canopy, which then affects the temperatures, is that something you or some of the other members of NPS team are studying? The graphing of how the hemlocks intersect with the trout population?
Yeah, I haven't done it, and it's kind of on my list, but it's not. I just haven't gotten there.
Yeah.
Too many pressing things.
Yep. And I interrupted you. I think you were going to talk about food for brook trout.
Oh yeah, there are plenty of aquatic insects out there right now. The one thing that we're noticing, and it's another thing that's on the list, and we haven't had time to study it yet, is that the mayflies and the stoneflies are emerging earlier in the year, and so that that could leave a longer period in the spring where the brook trout don't have as much food. The spring tends to be the time when they get a ton of food, but it could definitely change the dynamics and change the community of insects. But for now, it does seem like there's plenty of food in the streams.
Okay. Some questions coming in about what you plan to do in the next phase of the project and what you plan to do with the data that's being collected. And then obviously that goes beyond the scope of this project as it was presented to our board and voted on. And you have a very specific thing that you're doing this year, but can you talk a little bit about the resonance of the project in years to come?
Yeah, so we're going to try to combine our monitoring data with this project using the eDNA to identify these places that are, the great places, the great remaining places in the park. Because we're probably we can't focus everywhere, right? And so if we can identify those places, and then we can focus our efforts there, and whether that's focusing the treatment of hemlocks, or reducing sedimentation, things that I've already mentioned, or whether it's identifying that new habitat that's not occupied above waterfalls. Those are things that we can actually do on the landscape to try to change the dynamics of the system and maintain a healthy ecosystem for trout.
Great. We have another question. Do you have any experience on brook trout populations in kill versus no-kill streams?
I assume that they're talking about harvesting brook trout. So yeah, we've looked at the data, and there doesn't appear to be any suppressive effect of fishing. I guess for those of you who are not familiar, we do allow harvest of brook trout in some watersheds and not in others. And so I think the question is, can you see that effect in the populations? And the answer is no. There is not a difference in the average population or in the trend that we've been able to detect from those streams.
Okay. Another interesting question. Do you think climate change will warm the waters of streams at higher altitudes, and high, like the highest altitudes?
Yes, I think that climate change is going to warm the water everywhere. So the low elevation streams are closer to the danger zone, right? So if the temperature right now is 70 degrees in the stream and you bump it up 3 degrees to 73, stressful, right? But if the temperature right now is 63 degrees and you bump it up to 66, still great. So that, where you're starting makes a big difference. And, it likely is going to play out not perfectly equally across the landscape. It's not going to be 3 degrees everywhere, right? So I don't know. In fact, I think that the effect of mountains on these modeling outputs is a pretty poorly studied thing. There was a study here in Shenandoah that showed that the available stuff does a pretty bad job of accounting for the impact of mountains on past climate modeling and likely future climate modeling as well.
Okay. I'm getting signaled that I can only take one more question. Thank you, everybody, for your amazing questions. What other flora and fauna native to the park are you studying or are concerned about due to rising temperatures? Or maybe do you know about other colleagues who are planning on doing similar studies with other fauna?
Yeah, so focal species for me include the Shenandoah salamander, which is a terrestrial salamander that lives, like under rocks and logs in the woods. And it only lives at high elevations in the park. And so, above 3,000 feet. And so there's not very much habitat for it. It's federally listed as endangered. And climate change is likely to shrink their habitat substantially. And so that's one that we're focused on. The biggest thing in Shenandoah is the forest. There's so much forest, and it's critical for everything. It's critical for wildlife. It's critical for the streams. It's just the backbone of this park. And so, thinking about how to transition places that are not doing well because of climate impacts is one of the things that we're starting to focus on, and I think is one of the most important things that we can do.
Well, Evan, I think we could go on longer. We've got lots of questions still coming in, and our guests are just really thankful. They found that really interesting and informative, and I think you did a great job giving us call to action, but also hope. And we're really excited to bring you back at the conclusion of the project to hear about your data and next steps. So we will continue to keep all of our guests informed. I want to remind everybody that the program has been recorded and we will be sending it out to everybody who was invited. And Evan, thank you so much for being here. And thank you to all of our guests for being here. We hope that you enjoyed it and learned a lot. I just want to say as I close that we would not be able to fund initiatives like Evan's without our loyal donors who are incredibly generous and have been with us a long time. So thank you to all of them. And I want to remind you all that this work is important, it's continuing, and all of the projects, Evans included, work together to protect the park that we all love. So thank you, everybody. Thanks again, Evan, and we hope to see everyone in the park real soon.